Most Americans arrive in Australia thinking they'll understand it pretty quickly. The cities look modern, the people feel familiar. English is spoken everywhere. On the surface, it doesn't seem like a place that needs much adjustment. And because of that, many Americans assume life here will feel almost the same as home, just with better weather and a different accent. But the truth is, the one thing Americans always get wrong about Australia isn't obvious at all. It's not something you notice in your first week. It's not something locals explain to you. And it's not something written in any guidebook. It's something you only realize after you've been here long enough to feel slightly out of sync without knowing why. The disconnect sneaks up slowly, showing up in moments that feel almost right but somehow different. You can't quite name it at first, and that's what makes it so disorienting. Most Americans spend weeks or even months wondering if they're imagining the difference, questioning whether it's real or just in their heads. But it is real, and understanding it changes everything about how you experience Australia once you finally recognize what's been happening all along. In the US, life is often measured by momentum. Progress feels visible. Productivity feels central. Days are structured around efficiency, goals, and forward motion. When Americans arrive in Australia, they often bring that same internal measuring system with them. They look for familiar signals, how fast things move, how people respond to urgency, how time is treated during the day. And at first, nothing seems wrong. Everything works. Everything functions. But slowly, something starts to feel different, not in a bad way, just unfamiliar. Conversations don't rush. Even busy days feel less tense, and moments that would normally feel like wasted time somehow don't. Americans begin to notice they're the only ones checking their phones constantly during lunch breaks. They're the only ones apologizing for leaving work on time. They're the only ones treating every pause like it needs justification or explanation. The environment doesn't correct them directly, but it doesn't reinforce those habits either. And that absence of reinforcement creates a subtle pressure to reconsider patterns that once felt completely natural and necessary for success. What Americans often misinterpret is this: Australia isn't operating at a slower level, it's operating on a different priority. Life here isn't organized around constant acceleration. It's organized around sustainability. Time isn't treated like something you're always racing against. It's treated like something you move through. That difference shows up in small moments: how long people stay in conversations, how workdays are mentally framed, how evenings are protected. None of it is dramatic. None of it is announced. But over time, it quietly reshapes how daily life feels. The rhythm becomes noticeable in how colleagues talk about their weekends without turning them into productivity reports. It appears in how plans get made without excessive coordination or backup scheduling. It shows up in how people respond to delays or changes without immediate frustration or stress. Americans start to see that what they initially interpreted as lack of ambition is actually a different calibration of what matters and what deserves energy. The culture isn't rejecting achievement. It's rejecting the idea that achievement requires constant sacrifice of everything else in your life. This is where the misunderstanding happens. Many Americans assume balance means doing less. But in Australia, balance means distributing energy differently. Work still matters. Ambition still exists. Goals still matter. But they don't dominate every mental space at once. There's room for pauses without guilt. There's room for enjoyment without justification. And there's less pressure to constantly prove that you're doing enough. For Americans used to measuring life by output, this can feel confusing at first, like something important is missing. Even when nothing actually is, they wonder if they should be working harder, doing more, pushing themselves differently. They look around for signs that everyone else is secretly stressed or overwhelmed, and they don't find them. The cognitive dissonance creates an internal tension that can last for months. Americans often describe feeling like they're waiting for the other shoe to drop, expecting that the relaxed atmosphere must be hiding something more demanding underneath. But it's not. What you see is what you get, and that simplicity is what takes the longest to trust and accept as genuine. If this perspective feels different from what you've heard before, take a moment to like the video. It helps more people find conversations like this, especially the ones that don't shout for attention. Over time, many Americans begin to realize that Australia isn't asking them to change who they are. It's simply asking them to stop measuring every moment the same way they used to. And once that mental shift happens, everyday life starts to feel lighter. Not easier, just clearer. The constant internal calculations about whether you're doing enough, achieving enough, or maximizing your potential start to quiet down. You begin to trust that taking a proper lunch break won't derail your career. You start to believe that leaving work on time doesn't signal lack of commitment. You discover that life can feel full without feeling frantic, and that realization transforms how you approach not just your time in Australia, but your entire relationship with daily existence. The country doesn't force this change. It simply makes space for it to happen naturally if you're willing to let it. And most Americans eventually find themselves willing even if they weren't at first. This is why so many Americans say Australia feels comfortable without being overwhelming. It's not because everything is perfect. It's because life here leaves space for people to exist without constant internal pressure. The adjustment isn't physical, it's psychological, and it often takes months to recognize. Once Americans stop expecting life to constantly signal urgency, they start noticing something else instead. Presence. Moments feel complete on their own, without needing to lead somewhere else immediately. A coffee with a friend doesn't need to be networking. A walk on the beach doesn't need to be exercise with tracked metrics. A quiet evening doesn't need to be filled with productive activities or self-improvement projects. Things can simply be what they are, valuable for their own sake, rather than for what they contribute to some larger goal or achievement. This shift in perception doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen uniformly. Some Americans resist it for years, others embrace it within months. But almost everyone who stays long enough eventually feels some version of this recalibration, and most describe it as one of the most unexpected gifts of living in Australia, even if they never planned to receive it or thought they needed it in the first place. The one thing Americans always get wrong about Australia is assuming it should be measured the same way as home. But Australia isn't asking to be compared. It's asking to be experienced on its own terms. And once that shift happens, the country stops feeling confusing and starts feeling intuitive. If you want to understand what daily life in Australia teaches without ever saying it out loud, that's when the real adjustment finally begins. It's when you stop trying to translate Australian life into American terms and start accepting it as its own complete thing with its own internal logic that doesn't need justification or comparison. Americans who make this shift often say they wish they'd understood it sooner, that they'd spent less time resisting and more time simply receiving what was being offered. The lesson Australia teaches isn't about productivity or efficiency or even happiness in the conventional sense. It's about sustainability, presence, and the quiet confidence that life doesn't need to be complicated or intense to be meaningful. And that lesson, once learned, tends to stay with Americans long after they leave, reshaping how they think about time, work, relationships, and what it means to live well regardless of where they eventually call home.